Hi, I'm Kevin McKenzie, the head of product marketing at Prodigal, the pioneer of consumer finance intelligence. Thanks for joining us today. We also have Scott Hamilton with us, our banking strategy executive, and we're going to talk about the massive problem that customer complaints pose for banks and also for other lenders. So just go ahead and add questions or comments anytime you have them. Type them into the comments down below. And we'll be sure to answer those either right there, or if we run out of time, we can go ahead and follow up with you after. So to get us started, Scott, would you mind just sharing a little bit about your background and also what brought you over to Prodigal?
Sure, thanks. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity. So I've spent about 30 years in banking with Bank of America, JP Morgan, with Chase, Capital One,
Yeah.
um, and just have had a great time leading various transformation efforts, be it in the risk organization or in call centers, in order to identify ways to boost productivity and reduce risk at the same time. And it was actually in that final engagement in a couple of different banks where in the call centers trying to do exactly that, they were really challenged with some ability to analyze what's going on in their organization.
Mhm.
And when looking for various solutions to a really industry-wide problem, that's when I found Prodigal. And like 3 weeks later, I was here, and I've been here for a couple of years. It's sort of the tool that I wish I had when I was there.
Nice. That makes a lot of sense. So, with everything that you've seen and all of your experience, focusing in on customer complaints specifically for this conversation, why is it such a big challenge for banks or just other lenders? What makes this so difficult?
It's a great question. It's probably one of the best um, problem statements that if you can figure that out, you can figure out a whole bunch of other things out. So the challenge across banking and some non-banks as well, complaints represents a very difficult to define and even more difficult to execute upon sort of question in contact center. So not just voice, but also email, text chat, written even.
Yeah.
So everybody has a slightly different definition. Then they generally all lean on their frontline associates to execute and apply judgment on every interaction they have with every customer every day. And when you sort of multiply those nuanced judgment calls across, in some cases, thousands of agents across millions of interactions, the ability to do that consistently is extremely difficult. Um, I think I was talking to one particular bank a couple of days ago, and they did a pretty robust control assessment, and they determined that they were only capturing about half of what
Yeah.
they defined to be the definition of a complaint. Um, so about a third of those that were being captured were probably in the gray area that may or may not need to have been captured. But far more importantly, there was about half of the complaints that should have been caught weren't.
Yeah.
So
That
just
makes a
doing
lot of
that is
sense.
incredibly expensive. And even when you throw all that money at it, agents are confused, and everybody that reviews your ability to capture them all has a different opinion as to whether you did a great job or not.
Yeah. And when I hear you talking about that, I'm starting to think about with all of that complexity, what happens when a bank inevitably gets this wrong? And if they don't figure out this process, what are they looking at? Is this a matter of fines, penalties, being shut down? Kind of what is that range of consequences that people have to be concerned about when they're looking at this challenge?
What's really interesting about complaints is I think your revenue, those that are in revenue roles, those that are in cost roles, and those that are in quality or risk or compliance audit roles all care deeply about complaints. If you can uncover the root cause of them, you can definitely improve your revenue, your costs, your regulatory standing. So everybody's very interested in it. Some of the headwinds, it's as I said earlier, it's extremely difficult and inconsistent. There's an aggregation process across your call centers, your text chat. The CFPB has a front door. Your Office of the President has a front door. That there's 6 or 7 different ways that a complaint can come into your organization. Then there's this aggregation process. There's a cleanup process. Then a root cause like the process is very multi-threaded and takes a long time. So by the time the complaints are aggregated and trended, it can be a month, in which
Mm,
case, if there was something broken in the organization, it would have gone on and festered for a month.
yeah.
So the pain in terms of revenue or cost or regulatory impacts is substantial. And it's driven by the inefficiencies to do that, execute that process quickly. The worst case scenario, aside from just driving up your OpEx, is if it gets to a certain level from a regulatory standpoint. Obviously, when they do exams, they can have findings. If you have repeat findings, they graduate to a friendly MRA.
Mm,
And unfortunately, if MRAs are not dealt with robustly, they can mature into a consent order. And for those listening today, most people have had experience with a consent order, and they take years to address, and in some cases can cause millions and millions of dollars worth of penalties.
yeah.
And I've seen consent orders for complaints at multiple banks, all rooting back to this issue of really essentially capturing them consistently and then getting to the root cause efficiently.
Yeah. And it seems like with so much at risk here, I would imagine that banks have to have been trying to solve this problem for a very long time. And in your experience, when they go about trying to solve this, is it mostly approached from a hiring angle? Is it just adding more people to the workforce, just building more teams? Or if it's something else they've tried, kind of why do you feel like it hasn't worked yet with this being so important for them?
You're exactly right. About 10 years or so ago, it was strictly training the agents on the front line to identify complaints. Then, when it was subsequently determined that one was missed, go back to the agent and do a little hand holding and retraining, and then you repeat that process. And it was very much filled with training the agent, giving feedback, and repeating that loop. About 10 years, some banks were a little, some firms were a little advanced, some are still getting there. There's technology out there that assesses, in some case, in the voice case, transcriptions and looks for certain words. So I'm mad, or I want to talk to your manager, or this transaction got declined, or my whatever these phrases are. And
Mhm.
that was helpful in identifying, finding sort of needles in a haystack. But they're very, very specific needles. Did they use this phrase? And that was super helpful, where they generally bolted on that, often referred to as voice analytics,
Mhm.
into the call center, in order to augment what the agents were already finding. So that was super helpful. However, what most firms have found is those searching for those words, or that set of 2 or 3 words, um, created a whole bunch of false positives, and more importantly, false negatives. They're still missing, even with those tools, 50%, as referenced earlier, of the
Yeah.
complaint. So the technology really hasn't been there. And a few banks are continuing to optimize on that exact model. I've recently heard a few others actually taking out technology because of the false positives and negatives that they're generating. And
Yes.
and only recently has the evolution of AI and natural language processing and machine learning models have started to emerge. And that is giving quite a lot of promise and hope out there to use mass amounts of data to consistently apply that sort of contextual awareness of whether something is a complaint or isn't a complaint.
Yes. And you mentioned before having to sort of search for those exact keywords or exact phrases. Typically, did that all have to be manually programmed and manually defined by somebody at the bank? Was that pushed to the IT team, or who would be responsible for that? It sounds like that would be a lot of setup work just to have a solution that you described may or may not actually work the way you're aiming for it to.
You're exactly right. So
Mm,
if you and I got together every Tuesday for 2 hours, we could come up with more and more phrases that would map to complaints. And that's exactly what happens. These
mm,
tools, they convert voice to text into a transcription, and you tell it what to go look for. And every time you do that, you very quickly realize that you aren't catching everything. So you put more words or phrases into that list. And then the next week you do it again. So generally, it's the frontline QA teams or your complaint teams that are doing all that cleanup in the back end.
mm,
But at the end of that cycle, over a year or two, you still land at only being able to identify half.
yeah.
And so A, you miss half. B, you have a whole bunch of cleanup on the back end. And it's just a ton of work. And at the end of the day, the tools just flat out aren't getting what you need. So some banks are taking it out and going sort of old school with agents having to be your one and only frontline detective control.
Got it. Yeah, and I can understand why if that kind of legacy tool is the only option that you think is out there and just doesn't seem like it's worth the labor and the cost and the effort that would go into that. So I can totally understand there. And as we keep talking through this about how much sort of burden it's putting on those frontline agents or reps. So before you'd mentioned QA, but I've also heard that at least in some cases, sometimes maybe in the ballpark of like 80% of complaints could come through a conversation between a rep or an agent and a customer. And I'm thinking in those situations, with the definition of a complaint being so subjective, it has to be tough for that agent to even be able to consistently identify that, yes, this is a complaint and record that. Do you find that to be the case in your conversations and from your experience?
It definitely is difficult.
Mm,
As many as 1 in 4, 1 in 5, 1 in 6 calls should be captured as a complaint. I've seen sort of 1 in 10 in some circles. Um, Most of the complaints I've heard as high as 80 are not because of the experience they just had with the agent.
yeah.
So in those examples, um, it's just applying the judgment to determine whether this met the criteria or not. And it is a tremendous sort of productivity drag when those agents are often measured, their performance is measured on productivity. It isn't there's a judgment issue to identify, there's a productivity issue to enter and document and categorize them efficiently.
Mhm.
So those are challenges. The other sort of 20%, however, are a function of the experience that they just had on that call, and that can put the agent in an interesting spot where they're having to capture and report on essentially their inability to de-escalate a situation and satisfy the customer's needs in the moment, and
Yeah.
sort of
Mm.
raise their hand and admit that a complaint that should be entered because of the service that they personally rendered. Um, so it's a very tough role. The role is extremely difficult to begin with, but to layer on these sorts of judgmental um, requests of them is quite difficult. But at the end of the day,
Yeah.
it's super important to get done and get done well, because of all the other implications associated that if you don't, that you have to deal with.
Yes. And as you were saying that, I'm thinking if I kind of put myself in the shoes of that agent or representative, that, like you'd said, maybe 20%, maybe I sort of caused the complaint, but then the other 80, maybe I'm just the messenger that's recording it. But I feel like either way, I might get concerned that both would reflect negatively on me. If I just happen to be the unlucky agent that gets a lot of customers calling in with complaints unrelated to what I did, I could kind of think of myself being a little hesitant to even want to report those, kind of out of fear that it would hurt my reputation, that somebody looking at it might not look as closely and might wonder, why is this agent getting so many complaints? Do you ever see anything like that when it comes to just generalized underreporting, where I'm thinking like, especially if an agent doesn't have clear criteria, it seems like it would be in their best interest to just say, oh, it wasn't a complaint and let it go. I don't know if you
Yeah,
see that though.
you generally what happens is, and this does happen in production today in banks. It's a great point where
Hmm.
um, the back office organization will look at the quality of the complaints they're getting. They will
Hmm.
also look at where they're coming from. And imagine you plot your agents on a bell curve. This one agent is submitting three times as many complaints per 100 calls as the this other agent at the other end of the spectrum. So who's right? So is
Yeah.
one person over reporting? Is one person under reporting? It's another exception report that the back office will go and dig into, and yet again, sort of partner with the frontline managers in order to sort of tighten up the variation in the process, in order to get the best truth the most consistently as they can.
Yes. Okay. Can understand that. And now that seems like there's probably many different challenges, and we've only touched on a handful. Do you feel like if you're the rep and you're in their perspective, what do you actually think is the area in the process where they're most apt to make a mistake or where you've seen mistakes made? So, is it miscategorizing a complaint or is it deciding not to escalate to a team when they should have because they think they can control it and handle it? Or anything you have around that to think about what would be the biggest mistakes that an agent might encounter with all the things they have going on with this process?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say, but and this is what most of the consent orders and MRAs are based off of, is simply identifying whether a complaint needs to be captured, period. So it's a yes no judgment call. Most firms have pretty robust labor intensive back office processes to appropriately categorize and summarize and then research the root causes of the complaints once they are submitted. It's super helpful when the frontline agent would capture it correctly, and then add an explanation of the problem. That is very helpful for the back office, but by far the biggest issue is capturing it to begin with. Because if you don't capture it, you can't dig into it, right?
Yes.
That's the biggest issue that firms are wrestling with, and is the number one issue that the regulators are concerned with. They pull a slightly different call sample and they find the other 50% that you missed. And that really leads to some difficult conversations, especially when it happens repeatedly and you can't show how you're improving your organization's control environment to become better and better over time without just simply throwing more and more people at it.
Yes. Yeah. I'm also thinking a little bit about the maybe even the majority of the complaints that come into an agent that aren't because of something that they did or even have control over. And maybe it's just something as simple as the person contacting them misread the terms and conditions, or maybe they even did read them correctly and decide after the fact they don't like it and they're trying to get something a little extra and they're basically just being unreasonable. What type of pressure does that put on an agent when they basically have to talk somebody down and educate them on something when they're the one that's made the mistake? Any experience that you've had around that, or how difficult is that to have kind of that emotional intelligence and that empathy to coach somebody through a situation like that?
It's interesting that you bring that up. In the two examples that I was involved with at different banks,
Yeah.
strangely, the number one driver in what's causing complaints, to the tune of about half of them, are rooted in that exact point where the borrowers didn't quite understand the products or the terms, not so much the terms and conditions, but almost like how credit works, how
Ah,
credit cards work. When you get a bill, you're supposed to pay it. Like these sort of basic um, understandings as to what the product is, how it works, what your obligations are,
Yeah.
can create a lot of confusion, and it puts the ball in the hands of the frontline agents to explain and educate and train the consumer, who may not want to listen, how things work and why you have to pay your bill on time and stuff. But at the end of the day, it's a complaint that
Yeah.
needs to get fed back to, maybe in that case, the marketing team that needs to help clarify expectations at the outset prior to the
Hmm.
account being opened. I don't know, but at the end of the day, the customer is always right, and that's why we have talented agents on the front line in order to do the best they can, whatever the complaint may be.
Yes, makes sense to me. And now, as we start to look to wrap up this conversation, rather, I know that you have and are currently talking with several different banks, different lenders of all sorts about this complaint management challenge. And I'm wondering if you could shed a little bit of light on what you're working on specifically here at Prodigal to help out with this problem.
Sure. And again, back to the opening where I
Mm,
came from.
yeah.
I was wrestling with the same challenge that most firms are wrestling with today, and where a couple of leading firms are going is essentially to leverage the same technology that's being used on the front end of the business and the credit models and the marketing models. It's essentially machine learning capabilities in the fraud space, and using the same technologies in the call center. So
Mm,
what Prodigal has done, and why I joined, was they've essentially already done that. We've built pretty advanced natural language processing and machine learning models, um, only have come into existence over 3 or 4 years ago, so they're not very old. Um, so we've built the models. We've passed 250 million of these exact creditor, lender, banking conversations through the models, and have been able to train them to not just the words or phrases that are in question, but the context around which those phrases are spoken. And that's the secret sauce. When you can understand the context of the conversation, or the tonality or the sentiment, you can really begin to build machines to apply this very targeted judgment, um, on top of these conversations. And that's essentially what Prodigal does. In this case, around complaints, but there's other sort of use cases that rely on the same models. And it's showing tremendous promise. And we're, to your point, having conversations with a handful of leading sort of tech forward, analytics forward firms, and can deploy the capability unique to their definition of complaints pretty regularly or pretty easily. So it's an exciting space. I'd love to talk to anybody about it, but essentially it's machine learning models that are highly trained is the answer to unpacking, um, and accelerating, sort of the solution to this problem.
Yes. Okay. And now, as we're wrapping up, we've barely kind of scratched the surface on this complicated topic. But I'm curious if people that are watching right now would like to continue this conversation with you more one-on-one. What's the best way for them to get in touch with you or to keep talking with you, Scott?
Yeah, I'd love to talk to Scott Hamilton at Prodigal. Feel free to reach out. I'll also be at the ABA conference, the Risk Compliance, next week in San Antonio. Um, but yeah, just reach out. If nothing else, I'd love to hear how you're dealing with it. And then also, if nothing else, share what your peers are doing, what they've tried to do, what they've learned, and what sort of tools are out there. So it's an exciting space. Again, it's the tool I wish I had when I was there, and it's exciting to show it in action, and see people's response, and talk through what's possible.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Thank you for taking the time to talk with everyone today,
Yeah,
Scott.
perfect. Thank you.
Nice. And thanks to everyone who joined. If we by chance didn't answer your comment directly, again, we'll be sure to follow up with you. And if you're going to be there at ABA next week, look out for Scott, like we'd mentioned, and be sure to connect with both of us on LinkedIn. Also, go ahead and follow Prodigal for more updates. So, with that, have a great rest of the day, and I hope to talk with you soon.